Hello and welcome to another Atypical and Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm going to walk you through the front lines, but not a lot has happened. Not a lot has changed. Very little territory moving at all. I'm going to talk to you first about Belarus. There's been evidence that a whole load of troops have been moved into Belarus from Russia, particularly an area just around here, I think Gomel. I struggle to make sense of this, given that the Russians are struggling with troops down on their existing front lines. They desperately need reinforcements along here in order to make any kind of difference. There's been basically either a culmination or the Russians have been on the defensive now for weeks, if not months. And so then moving a whole bunch of effectively what could be reinforcements up to Belarus makes very little sense. I talked about the Belarusians having sort of 60, 70,000 people in their army, but of course that's only about 10,000 frontline troops. So with the Russians providing some extra troops, what would they realistically do? The only thing that makes sense of that is so the Russians have announced, Shoigu announced 300,000 people being mobilized. That's, according to some evidence at least, that it's probably more like 1 million. And if that is going to be 1 million troops after they've been actually mobilized and trained, then you can imagine a scenario where there's 500,000 troops or so plugging the holes in all these front lines, so that now you have a completely reinforced front line from north to south and east to west in Ukraine. And then that allows a whole bunch of troops to be placed in Belarus to then threaten maybe Kyiv again, an advance from the north, and the whole theatre looks completely different. But that really does depend upon these conscripts, these mobilized conscripts, being of that number and being able to do the job. We are already seeing conscripts in the front line up in the Svatove-Kreminna fronts, and some have already died with very little training, and their parents are pretty upset back, and families are pretty upset back in Russia. So this is causing a little bit of worry amongst Russian population as they're starting to see body bags come back with their own conscripted children or relatives who have received very little training. So anyway, there you go. Let's look at the Kupiansk-Svatove-Kreminna front here, and really not a lot has changed. So I talked yesterday about Vilshana to Pershotrovnevi, a little bit of pressure from the Ukrainians forward here, possibly going northeasterly to circle around Svatove eventually in a large encirclement. That there was Tabivka that was apparently liberated. We've got sign of there being some prisoners taking a little settlement here on a PO7 road. Pilshani being, some people have that still being sort of fought over, but my line then comes down here to the top of the Zherobots River, where you've got Ryahorodka, but then Kovalivka being possibly liberated over the last couple of days. And Svatove, they're only about sort of 12-15 kilometers from Svatove, arguably at the moment, which presents a number of problems for the Russians. Now, on the flip side, the Russians are building these trenches and defensive lines. Okay, now that is not insignificant. Okay, and these are stretching an awful long way with these dragon's teeth, and often two lines of dragon's teeth with some anti-tank trenches and troop trenches as well, when they are at their most, well built defensively. Now this apparently reaches all the way from Svatove to Kreminna. So if they've actually done that along that entire front line, that is quite some feat. So you've got the highway here, you've got a defensive line going down to the west of the Krasna River, and you have a buffer zone where the Russian troops are still active and defending, and arguably even on the counterattack down near Kreminna towards Zarishne. If that is actually the case, then and they are being supplied with a great number of mobilized troops, then actually we could be entering a period of quite a stalemate. And this is where the critics of Ukraine were saying they should have carried on with the momentum. It should have continued and continued, because now they've handed the momentum, or at least they've handed the initiative back to the Russians, and they have time to build their defenses. So we shall see whether that's actually the case. Here's just a map of what's going on in the Svatove area, as according this is from yesterday. So, daily report, the Ukrainian General Staff says that Ukrainian aircraft carried out 25 strikes across all areas of operation. That's nothing unusual. These are reported to have struck Russian logistics and troop concentrations. Suppression of enemy air defense, SEED, I've talked about that in previous videos. Sorties are reported to have destroyed 6 additional Russian air defense complexes. So this is quite important, very important. So to take out air defenses in the area it means that you can establish some kind of air superiority and then start being able to support your troops from the air. These strikes and interceptions are indicative of Ukraine's expanding air defense and frontal aviation capabilities. On the flip side, down in the Kherson area, the Russians are using a lot of munitions, kamikaze drones to hit Ukrainian air defense. I showed a decoy that was hit the other day, but I'll show you in the extra video later some actual surface-to-air missile installations blowing up look like, and how you know that they definitely aren't decoys. And the previous one was a decoy, but the Russians are hitting Ukrainian air defenses down in the south. So there are things going on as ever. There are attacks from either sides, but really no significant changes there. So I'll let you know as soon as I know something more. Again, Bakhmut, we have the attempt to encircle Bakhmut with Opitny and Ivangrad below, and Soledar and Bakhmutsky further up north there, and that producing this kind of attempted pincer. So you've got Soledar. Apparently they just haven't moved up here, and there is all this toing and froing as to who owns what down south here, both at Opitny and Ivangrad, and further down to Avdivka. Now, interestingly, I had a commenter on the YouTube thread yesterday from the Global Augmentation Group, and just to check who they are, these are people who are working on the front lines in Bakhmut, for example, working to supply medical aid. These are combat veterans working to provide medical aid and humanitarian aid, and to evacuate humans and animals, and just help out on the ground out there. And this guy, and I take their word for it, they've given me the credentials, and it appears to be the Global Augmentation Group actual YouTube avatar, and seems to be who they are, says nothing has changed in Bakhmut in months. There have been no real advances by the Russian forces. Every advance has been pushed back by the Ukrainian army. The Russian forces hold the line on elevation with the 2 crossings on the right bank, but have not advanced into the city on the right bank. They have not even advanced towards Soledar in an attempt to flank the Ukrainian defenses. On the south, Ukraine still holds the line and Opitny. There is no contention in the southern portion of the city. Ukraine holds the high ground on the left bank. The city centre is lowland and is centre of artillery attacks by Russians. Russians have blown the central bridge and does target the land bridge a little further to the south. My credentials, myself and my teams have been in Bakhmut for at least 2+ months. I will not discuss further specifics of Ukrainian defensive positions due to OPSEC, operational security. Feel free to look us up for verification. So what he's basically saying, here's a topography of Bakhmut. And you can see this is Bakhmut there. It is lowland as the river comes through Bakhmut, and you've got a bit of high ground to the east, and then a lot more to the west. And of course, that allows artillery to be thrown into Bakhmut. And they're saying the Russians are hitting the center of Bakhmut. I mean, the Russians don't care about hitting civilians and wiping out civilian architecture and infrastructure. So they're just happy to bombard and be apocalyptic and then move in afterwards. But apparently the Ukrainians do hold that quite strong, and there is some evidence suggests that they're actually really well defensively set into Bakhmut. So the only option really for the Russians is that encirclement. So the key is Soledar and Avdivka, Opitny, to actually really a wider encirclement around here and around there, in order to force the Ukrainians out of Bakhmut. A full frontal assault is just going to be really costly in time, effort, and resources. So anyway, the point being, there's not a lot of move, and there's some evidence from someone who's on the ground there to suggest that there's not a lot of movement. Right. This is the map from Defmon. Defmon is great, well worth following, and on Twitter. But this is to look at Donetsk. So let's take a little trip back to our main map. Here's Donetsk. Why I want to show this, because I haven't really shown it before, but I've talked about Pisky before and Pervomaisky, which are these two tiny little areas to the west of Donetsk that the Russians are advancing meter by meter every day. But there's a larger kind of pincer movement attempted with Avdivka. So that is, a lot of people talk quite a bit about Avdivka. So let's just have a little look, see what's going on and what that looks like. So here is the front line, as according to Defmon, with this, very slow. Look, another Opitny. And in fact, some people have said that this could be why there's been some confusion about Opitny, because they might be talking about the one near Donetsk and not the one near Bakhmut. But there you go. So Pervomaisky, Pisky, here you've got that tiny little sort of advance that the Russians have made, and they're trying to encircle Avdivka because it's tactically fairly important to do so around here. So if they can encircle that, then they get a nice straight front line, and the Ukrainians don't have such an easy attack on Donetsk with artillery and whatnot. So really, the Russians want to be doing that encirclement. They're trying. They're just not getting very far. So very little movement there. Again, which takes us all the way down to Kherson. Not a lot going on the Zaporizhzhia front line. So we're going to move down to Kherson, where not a lot is happening. So again, we've got the stable front line here, where the Russians have dug themselves in. And I talked previously about how there was possibly a little bit of contention as to exactly what little villages were, who controlled what. And here is the front line that I've been using. And I said yesterday that actually there has been some attacks or counterattacks from the Russians over in this sort of northeastern segment of this front line in the Kherson area. And, Kachkarivka has been possibly under contention. It's not, the front line isn't necessarily at Milove, but possibly a bit further back towards Duchany. And the Russians have attacked towards Novokamyanka as well. Now, apparently, also the Ukrainians mounted, according to the Ukrainian sources, the Russian sources, the Ukrainians mounted quite a big attack yesterday on this front line with quite a lot of armament, and it was repelled by the Russians successfully. Now, that is coming from the Russians, and I guess the truth will come out eventually. But if they are mounting attacks and getting repelled because the Russians have successfully dug themselves in, then that doesn't bode well, particularly for the Ukrainians. However, things could be happening. That could be just feeling their way around to find the right place to attack, because we've started to see on social media that the Ukrainians are calling for OPSEC again around this area. So they're asking for media not to be sharing information about, where Ukrainians are. Not that I'm particularly doing that here. This is just very general. I'm not saying anything different from yesterday. But if they are, if that kind of OPSEC request has gone out on social media again, then it could look like, we might see some attempts by the Ukrainians to burst through these lines somewhere around the Kherson region, whether that be up there in the northeastern part or in this David Brid salient, or down south near this other salient towards Kherson city itself. The Russians are still sort of worrying and pulling out civilians. That is something they've been doing, and so therefore that indicates that they are ready for some big attack. And we have been seeing amassed forces apparently up in the Kherson area for the Ukrainians. So something will probably happen in the next few days if it's not already happening today. Anyway, there you go. Really, no change on anything. A couple of attempts by Ukrainians here and there, and attempts by Russians here and there, but no breaking through lines. Just what's going on with these Russians being poured into Belarus. is the question, and what strategically, what does that represent? Anyway, thank you. I'll try and get out an extra video later. I'm doing a live interview, a philosophical one, so I don't know whether I'm going to have huge amounts of time this afternoon, but I will try. Thank you for being part of this. Please like, subscribe, share. If you appreciate what I'm doing, you can join my channel or support me in any other ways. It's all down in the description, or you can follow the link to uasupporter.com/ATP, that's Atypical Philosopher. And if you decide to get any merchandise, which I know a few of you have already, that's really great, then 10% of that goes to my channel, and I really appreciate that. So look, here's some mugs. Check out some mugs that show your support for Ukraine, if you are pro-Ukrainian. If you're pro-Russian, you can still buy them, actually, because still support my channel, so don't worry about it. Yeah, please buy them, but you might not be appreciated by your fellow pro-Russians if you're drinking from a mug like this. There you go. Anyway, thank you. Goodbye. See you later.